Hello, world. Welcome to the first and only live stream video engagement from the Census Data Design Standards, Web Design Standards team partnership. This is hopefully the beginning of a long and fruitful relationship working together. We're going to present some of the work that we've done the last month-ish, a little more than a month, and that we've been working on. But first, I want to give a little shout out to one of our team members. Today is Ryan's birthday. So we just want to say happy birthday to him. Should be saying this monkeys. So, and with that, I will pass to Liz.
Great, thank you so much, Will. I'm going to kick this off by showing how we started with a deep review of other work on this subject and how we translated that deep review into very specific census guidelines that we think will communicate best with the audiences for this project. So let me begin just by talking about our research. So looks like I'm presenting. I'm sorry, but I can't see. Hopefully I'm moving this.
I think it's,
is this you?
I'm presenting the slides also, but.
Well, Will, can you move to the next slide then?
I think we, there he is.
Hello?
Perfect. Will, please move to the next slide.
Okay, cool. Okay, now do you all see it?
Yes, thank you. So, cool. Research. Next slide. We reviewed quite a bit of work. We reviewed existing guidelines and standards, various academic papers that are widely cited or that show up in university syllabi. Chris Goranson, who could not be here today, has a background in data visualization for public health. And so he brought his previous expertise in statistics and data visualization to formulating the list of works to review. Within those, we looked for recommendations with multiple citations. That is to say, recommendations that showed up across multiple works, and then we assembled a summary for all of the various data types, components, and visualizations that we received. Next slide. To give you a better sense of what those materials looked like, here's one of the style guides we used. It's from the Sunlight Foundation, which focuses on open data, and we really liked the clarity of directions like when to use and your data should look like, because that really helps novices who may not know, for example, what form of tabular data indicates a good candidate for a bar chart. Next slide. We also reviewed and took quite a bit of inspiration from the UK government Statistical Services Guide to Chart Types, Selecting Color, and Do's and Don'ts. One of the really important things to note here is that this is an official government publication. So its tone and voice are, we think, particularly appropriate for our government publications. And you'll note that their language is straightforward. It uses very clear, plain language, but it's very precise and it's friendly. It addresses the reader directly, but it's also very authoritative. It uses words like never. It uses the imperative tone, and that's something we really picked up on. Finally, moving to the next slide, we wanted to point out the use of code snippets in and other kind of clear technical instructions that are used in press outlets who focus on visualizing data for the web. And since this project is really intended to help people visualize data for web, we picked up on that functional cue as an important type of content that isn't necessarily present in style guides aimed at, say, print users. Next slide. Based on conversations with members of Census, we defined two initial audiences that we also drew from other government publications. The first are novices who can use the tools but probably don't grasp all of the little nuances that make the difference between an accurate visualization and a misleading one. And we also did, however, want to serve the experts who just need quick reminders. They already understand the concepts. They just want to know what the right style might be. Next. This provided some clear content direction. We wanted to create a guide that was concrete. That is to say, it had realistic data and real data, I should say, realistic scenarios and very concrete, tangible examples of what works and what doesn't. And relatedly, that's instructional. It leads people step by step through a process. It is very directive. It uses a bunch of do's and don'ts. For example, it uses imperative tone, much like the UK guide, and also straightforward. That is, like the UK guide, it uses, and the Sunlight Foundation guide, it uses plain language. It tries to explain technical terms where necessary in that plain language and colloquial tone. And for experts, it can take them directly to what they need. That is to say, experts shouldn't have to read through paragraphs and paragraphs of text just to know what the correct specification for a bar chart should be. Next slide. Via our review, then, we got to this high-level taxonomy of everything that a style guide could conceivably cover. Charts, graphs, tables, maps, diagrams. We can break them out if we would like. Charts being more precise, graphs being more precise, charts being more illustrative. We wanted to highlight that tables can and are used as data visualizations. Think about using color within cells. Maps and diagrams, such as tree maps, Lincoln node diagrams, etc. Mind you, we can't get to all of these types of charts initially, but we did want to establish what the landscape was so that we could narrow down on some of the most interesting and common types. Next slide. Next slide. Can you hear me? Next slide. We began with the most common chart types, which are bar charts, line charts, area charts, and composite charts. And of those, our demo will focus on line charts. Down recommendations via this ground-up assessment of the literature review that I mentioned. And this became initially the framework for our take at the Census Data Visualization Guidelines. With that, I will pass to my colleagues for a demo of what these things look like in practice.
Hello. So before we get into live charts, I was going to share kind of how we broke things down visually. So one of the kind of layers of complexity within this census problem was that Census itself is kind of going through a rebranding effort. So they didn't have a strict set of, a strict style guide that we could use. So our approach was to start with just two things that they had the best idea of, which was they knew which fonts they were using. They had a pretty good idea of what colors they were using. So we just kind of quickly, based on the web design standards, we kind of cobbled together some visual styling for what we might use to build a little microsite. And, we just kind of started comping these things up. Let's see, I probably need to make this a little bit larger so that you can see it. Start thinking about the information architecture and how one might navigate around. And then, kind of laying out just in terms of typography and hierarchy, how we might show charts and things like that in on this site. And you can kind of see here, we were thinking about, showing a bar chart with a negative value and, kind of diving into some of those specific things. And then even if we got down to the real minutia and started talking about like the do's and don'ts of like, do this, don't do that, kind of back and forth, which we know from some interviews that we had with some Census folks that was a helpful thing. And then we got into laying out the actual site, which we have these comped together. And then one of the other things that I thought would be a kind of a neat experiment, if you will, would be kind of, I picked like a random, just looking at the thumbnail itself on census.gov, I just found a super simple chart that I thought I could just kind of, hey, what would happen if we took some existing charts and just kind of styled them in what Census is kind of in the middle of doing right now, and which was this Hispanic student enrollment on the rise. And so, I just did I think it would be kind of neat to, especially in like almost a layout, like interactive thing. It'd be kind of neat if this was like you moused over, remove white space between the clusters and you saw this little space like light up, like, hey, that's kind of adding a little visual noise. Like if you kind of compare them to one another, all those little grid lines kind of peeking through kind of makes it a little more jittery. And, how might we kind of think about Census branding as kind of, while it needs to be there and kind of, be this kind of, permanent footnote that always exists on all things Census. I think it, when I see it really dark like this, like my eye just kind of goes to this red and I kind of skip right over the data, then I just go to the logo. And I thought it would be interesting, what if we just, the type was all one color, we kind of got rid of, well, like I'm the first person to want to throw an illustration in something, but I think when you're talking about data, I feel like it could be a little distracting, or at least on the margin of. And even moving this legend, I didn't really need to move it. Like at first I thought, I'm like, oh, the legend should be close, the key should be closer to the data itself. But I think the reason this is kind of hard, you kind of skip over this key on the left, is because it's so close to this, super powerful thing, this kind of header area. And then on the footnote itself, you could take into consideration that, hey, this is going on the web, and you don't need to, we can just make the source itself the link. We don't need to have a fully typed out URL and things of that nature. And then I think also divorcing the logo from the text kind of helps the logo itself be the like stamp of approval on the graphics. And it lets, I mean, from my understanding, it sounds like a lot of these data visualizations are they kind of come from a lot of different places, so I can kind of see this list getting pretty robust, and so it lets this breathe, and it's pretty flexible, and you can add more there as needed. And the other thing that we talked about a little bit with Luke was, what if this was kind of a case study, where like what story are you trying to tell with this chart? I mean, the title of it is enrollment on the rise, and I don't really see it on the rise at a glance. I see it kind of getting worse over time. because, you know, as a caveman, I read from left to right, and, you know, it takes me like a minute to realize that the bars themselves are dates, which is not necessarily the most intuitive thing. And so my first crack at that was like, well, okay, what if we just style it, you know, a la Census? What does that make it any clearer? Well, I think it's easier to look at. There's less noise and things like that. Maybe it's slightly more clear, but I'm not really getting the story again. And so I thought, well, what if it was a line chart? Maybe, you know, I don't know. Sorry, I'm going to zoom in, probably make this a little easier to see. What if it was line chart? Would that make it more clear? You know, get rid of the kind of the bouncing bars everywhere and just make it a line. And I'm still kind of not getting that story that Hispanic student enrollment is actually going up. It looks like it's going down to me. So then my last thought was like, well, what if there are separate little charts? And now at a glance, I can see that they are all going up because the years now became, you know, part of the x-axis, and you know, it's pretty clear the data is going up. So that was something that I was also thinking about, and you know, other things too. When you see progressions, I think what is really instructive to folks that are trying to build these data visualizations is what happens as your data or your data sets start getting more complex. And you can see how when you just have a one data set, you know, with just a single bar chart, and then when it goes to 2 columns like this, you know, like all these little things have to start changing everywhere to kind of accommodate, and those can greatly affect how easy it is to read. And so it's kind of neat to see kind of a progression of a chart becoming more complex as you add data to it. And finally, you know, we kind of put together, I did talk to Census a little bit about some of their color choices, which had some color contrast issues. And so I kind of nudged them to kind of like, hey, you know, you could either add a couple tertiary colors that were just a tad darker than their parent color and use them as needed. I think we actually do this for the nav and the site that you'll see in a minute. Or if you wanted links to be you know, if you wanted this teal to be in here, you know, you would have to make it just a hair darker, but you know, you really don't notice a little visual design trick when color is in short, you know, small little forms. It looks a lot darker than it actually is, or lighter, so rather. And it like this color looks like that color, but in fact, it's a little bit darker, which you can probably see here. Boop. That is all I've got. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and pass it to John.
John? Did you freeze?
Yeah, he looks a little frozen. Mark, are you comfortable going next, or do you want to wait for John?
Yeah.
Oh, wait, he might be back.
Hey, I'm back. Cool. Can you hear me?
Yep, we can.
Awesome. Let's see. In case this is the reason it crashed, I'll try without presenting an application window and just share the full screen. Cool. So we heard a lot so far about all the different kind of investigations that we did through Liz and trying to gather all of this guidance and really distill it down into something that's like short and digestible and understandable by different groups of people. Ryan showed a little bit about the brand investigation and you know, trying to understand what kind of, how do we want to apply the Census brand guidelines to this kind of work? Where do we draw the line between the sort of guidance that goes into the charts themselves and the site that we're building here? So what I want to show is a sort of preview of the doc site that we put together to start actually displaying some of this information. So we put together a pretty simple site structure with a couple different categories of work here that we want to showcase. And so pretty simple landing page here, just explaining kind of what the Census data design guidelines are. We've distilled some design principles here. So these are sort of a general set of principles that you can use to help guide you as you're creating great data visualizations. It covers things like using plain language and a little bit about what that means, thinking in a mobile-first way. So, when you're designing visualizations, how are you going to deal with hover states? How will you deal with small text, things like this that really affect the mobile users? Picking the right kind of visualization. This is something that Ryan kind of got into at the end there, of how you can choose 3 different visualizations and tell 3 different stories with the same data. So thinking about what story you want to tell and how you're going to do that. Establishing and following a style guide. The uniformity that the style guide can offer adds credibility to your work. It makes things clear and understandable. And all this is really important with the data. Citing the data is really important. This is something that we heard throughout all of our research with folks at the Census, that understanding where the data source is coming from, specifically what release, what survey did it come from, things like this, because obviously things change over time, and something that came from 2010 is completely different from something that came from 2015, a different survey setup. And most of all of these things kind of lead into being a trusted source and making sure that folks understand that they can trust the data that you're presenting them. We set up a section here for all the different visualization types, and I think there's way more than just the 5 that we got here. But the main goal of this first phase of the project was to really just start to showcase some of these, and to either set up sections for each one of them, or actually built out the full sort of data and explanation for this. So here's an example of some bar chart guidance that we go into, when to use it, the basics of what this is, and then some examples of this, which I think we're going to go into a little bit more later. Components, this is a section that we're still working on a little bit, but the idea here is to provide a little bit more information on all the different things that go into creating a visualization. So the titles, the colors that are used, the fonts that are used, things like that, and some guidance on those things. And then lastly, the references. So this is sort of a framework where anyone working on this site in the future, whether it be a future 18F team or folks at Census wanting to build upon this work, this is kind of where we put together all of the information that we use to draw up this plan. And I guess lastly, just to showcase or talk a little bit about the structure of the site itself. After we sort of did some information architecture work to understand what all this guidance was going to look like, we decided that the best framework to kind of get started with this was to actually use the core of the Jekyll site that powered the US Web Design Standards doc site. So we did just that, and essentially took the project that powers that site, stripped it down, and added in this new data design guidance. So with that comes a lot of stuff that's kind of already done for free, so to speak. There's layouts here for different page types that can each be customized. So, we built some particular ones for pages, for a home page, things like that. And then the page structure for the different content as we add more content. It's all markdown files here, so really easy to edit and have people collaborate on without needing them to know a lot of HTML. They can just kind of add in some things here with simple markdown text. So that's about it for the site itself. On the repo, there's instructions for building it, running it locally, all that kind of stuff. And yeah, so I think with that said, I can pass it on to Marco.
You're still muted, Marco.
Yeah.
Oh, there we go. Okay. Hi, everybody. I worked on some of the coding side of building the charts. So we built some example charts to show a little bit more of what this would look like. These charts were built with the D3 data library in JavaScript. That means they're SVG. And kind of the basis of how this works is that you specify a container and you can set the size. So here we set a full width container of a certain height. And you pass that to D3 and generally lay out the chart in the ways that we described earlier of based on our research. And it automatically uses the correct colors and sets certain parameters around the data. And so our idea with this would be is that we'd build somewhat of an API for Census so that Census employees would be able to use the API to easily create charts of the with the Census styling with the correct standards set by Census. And I'm going to go into that in a second. So right here we have two examples of bar charts. One of them is showing data that's percentage. Another is just showing arbitrary data for different states. And we also built a...
You're not sharing your screen. While I love looking at you.
There we go. So here, back to what I was saying, here we have bar charts for showing percentage data and arbitrary data. And we have some line charts for showing data over time. So to go into the idea of an API for this, let me do percent mode. We built a JavaScript API on top of D3, and this would make it easier for developers to create charts. And so the goals of this API would be allowing developers to specify the important information for a chart, like the data and where the axis should be and things like that, and not worrying about implementation details of how to actually build the chart in D3, which is a relatively complicated process. There would be a possibility that developers would receive warnings for when they specify a practice that Census doesn't agree with, and they would receive a warning in their browser for that. Oops. Go back. And then this would make it really easy to have consistency across charts, because your way of creating a chart would just be to kind of input the right information in this API, and it would create a chart that is already consistent based on all these rules set before. So like, some of the things that the API will allow the developer to decide is like where to display the chart on the page, which would include like the sizing, a little bit of the sizing information for the chart. Like you'd be able to set a height and maybe a width for it. What the X and Y axis should be, if it's going to be a horizontal bar chart or a vertical bar chart, for instance. How the legend should appear, which would probably allow for legend to be modified and set yourself. Things about number formatting and what should happen on user interaction. And so I wrote this is unimplemented code, meaning that there is some functionality here that has not actually been done, but this is the idea of how it would work, where you will, there'll be different types of charts you can create. So we're creating a bar chart here with some data we have, and we're adding it to, a certain spot on the HTML page. We're also, using an API for a legend and creating a simple legend. We're setting the access data, what it should be. We're also setting some, doing some custom number formatting, which is really close to how you'd be doing it in D3. And finally, on hover, when a user is hovering their mouse over the chart, we'll check, we'll have a simple API for checking what the current thing they're hovering on. And then in this case, we're setting the opacity of all the other bars to 0.5 so that what they're hovering on is highlighted. So this is just an example of what the API would look like. It would obviously be probably a lot of different things would happen with it when it's actually implemented, but this is what this is what could be. I think that is it for the API, and I'm done. How many want to finish up?
Yep. So with that, we're going to wrap up and call into a conference line to kind of talk about the work, answer questions and such. We'll stop recording this. So here is the call-in info. You can go ahead and close.
Can you present present your
sorry.
screen well,
Yep.
so folks on YouTube.
Good point.
So yeah, go ahead and close this YouTube window. I mean, maybe write the number down or start dialing the number and enter the conference number. And we will talk to you on the phone line in a couple minutes. I'll keep this up and keep this presenting for a few minutes while everyone dials in. And we will talk to you in the conference. Thanks, everyone. See you on the internet.